Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Melissa Vidreta, and I'm the research coordinator for the 21 CSLA State Center. I'd like to welcome you to today's research practice webinar entitled Strengths and Challenges of Equitable School Leadership in California's Diverse Rural Context. As an educator who grew up in Red Bluff, California, and attended pre-K to 12th grade in rural schools, I'm excited about today's topic and its implications for equity. Today's webinar is hosted by 21 CSLA. We are dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders at the teacher, site, and district levels to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. The commitment that guides our work is that leaders for equity transform education by improving access, opportunity, and inclusion for both students and adults. Our focus is particularly on those who are systemically marginalized and historically underserved, ensuring that everyone in our educational community has the opportunity to thrive. 21 CSLA is a project of the California Department of Education, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and the State Board of Education. Before beginning today's webinar, we would also like to acknowledge the land that we occupy. In our active dismantling of the oppressive and erasure effects of colonial structures, we would like to acknowledge that today's webinar takes place on the land which the University of California at Berkeley occupies, the territory of the Wichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples. We recognize and honor the continuous presence and living history of Indigenous peoples. I would now like to introduce you to today's webinar host, Dr. Jabari Mahiri. Jabari Mahiri is a professor in the Berkeley School of Education and the Brinton Family Chair in Urban Education. He is faculty director of BSc Leadership Programs and chair of the Leadership Board for 21 CSLA.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everyone to our 21 CSLA Research Practice webinar. Today's webinar will be framed with a question that focuses on strengths and challenges in rural education. What are key beliefs and practices that educational leaders must embody to support equitable learning outcomes for all students across California's diverse rural context? We are featuring a researcher who will share her work with rural education and be responded to by a leading practitioner who is engaged in this same kind of work. And we'll also entertain questions from our participants after the two presenters have had their opportunity to talk. Dr. Kristina Hesbol is an associate professor in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies Department at the University of Denver's Moorridge College of Education. Her research focuses on educational leadership and policy issues across two lines of inquiry. The first focuses on leading improvement to disrupt rural educational inequity, including leaders' pivotal systemic role in improving complex intractable problems. The second examines networked improvement communities, particularly their capacity to accelerate movement in rural and remote learning. Her current research examines the behaviors and attitudes of bright spots, in quotes, rural educational leaders globally, those who lead schools in which traditionally marginalized students demonstrate improving learning outcomes. Please welcome Dr. Hesbol.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahiri, and it's a joy to be with you this afternoon. I'd like to open my comments by thanking Rosanna Ayers, who's an EDD student in the program studying science education in rural spaces, and we connected at a conference this past fall. So let's go to the next slide. I'm a first-generation college kid that grew up in a rural space in Illinois, and I've served in a wide variety of educational roles. And I want to talk today about CIRCLE. CIRCLE is the Center for Innovative Rural Collaborative Leadership Education, and it's actually a program center of UCEA, the University Council for Educational Administration. So we, unlike what you all are doing when you talk about research practice partnerships, we're a practice research partnership where we lift up practitioners as the experts in the field. And the purpose of Circle was actually to serve as a third space for lots of different research interests and partnerships with people in the field. While there are some things that are consistent across many rural sites, like the challenges of recruiting and retaining rural educators and rural leaders, there also are some very nuanced place-based sorts of issues. So we across all of the rural spaces in which we're operating, we want to make sure that there are some things that we hold in common as important. Not the least of which is understanding about rural cultural wealth. So in many of our small rural towns, and I'm in Colorado, so we have what are called not only remote, we have beyond remote places, frontier places. We have places that have been predominantly white students and families for many, many, many years. Some of those places also have had students who are native Spanish speakers who have lived in those same communities for generations. And the assumption has been erroneously made that they just wouldn't do well. And so nothing was done to make any difference. And so by engaging with leaders and teams in these small rural places in a practice research partnership, we find that we can absolutely increase equitable learning outcomes for every student. So we have a networked improvement community, the Rural Innovative School Leadership Networked Improvement Community, and that accelerates sharing. So we don't come in to teach in it. Instead, we bring people together from all around the country, and now we have other countries working with us as well. And we hear from all of you about what are the challenges that you're struggling with and what's working well. What are those bright spot sorts of things that are going on? Because we do that to disrupt rural stereotypes. And we do that consistent with the fact that we've learned that there's very little training in leadership training related to culturally responsive leadership. We use the Khalifa et al. Model, the CR, culturally responsive school leadership model, for much of our work. So we're also very interested in some, I want to share some examples with you of some places where we've found this happening. There is a district in rural Colorado that had an influx of Eritrean families maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And there were, in fact, students who identify as Hispanic in that community who had not been successful for generations. And so all of a sudden, Eritrean folks came along, and the men in these families went to work in the only industry in this town, which is a meatpacking plant. And they're Muslim families, and they started getting fired when they were praying during the day. So the American Civil Liberties Union came into very remote Colorado and said, this is not only illegal, it's unethical. Let's talk about this. And their schools didn't know what to do with students who didn't speak either Spanish or English. A neighboring school was neighboring down 30 miles away, was a member of Circle, and said, why don't you think about engaging with some of the work that Circle's doing? And so at the end of the day, what happened, because of some of the projects and initiatives of SCAP, the folks in the district that I referred to initially did get involved. They worked on something called the Student-Centered Accountability Project, where we shift the paradigm from accountability to responsibility. And people are suddenly looking now at a number of different epistemologies. So what about tribal crit, and how does that look in our classrooms? I'll talk a little bit later on about the challenges of that these kinds of changes bring, particularly when we have predominantly white female teachers and predominantly white female leaders in these districts. There's another example I'd like to share in Othello, Washington. So this is definitely a bright spot leader. Othello, Washington is a remote rural district that has 74% of their students qualifying for free and reduced lunch. About 40% of them are English learners, or at least they're identified as English learners. I think there are more. 15% are migrant, and 91% identify as Latinx. The superintendent is a man who began as a native Spanish-speaking paraprofessional in this district 30 years ago. His family work in the orchards, as do most of the families in the community. And he began as a parapro. And fast forward through some really circuitous things that happened along the way, he followed a very difficult superintendent who was very linear and very almost militaristic about, this is what we're going to do. And the current superintendent, to whom I refer as a bright spot leader, developed relational, he's a relational leader. He developed relationships throughout the community, speaking in Spanish. And not all of the people who are Latinx speak Spanish. Some of them speak indigenous languages, and some from Central America, for example. He helped them to feel included. So during the pandemic, he used ESSER funds to train what he called abuelas, and he could call them abuelas. There were 40 women who he hired on an hourly basis, and he and his literacy team taught them discrete literacy skills. And they, as a team in their district, they mapped every single student on their state standards and substandards to see where their strengths and challenges were. Every day after lunch for 60 minutes, groups of no more than 4 students worked with an abuela on their particular area. This is Bloom's mastery learning, if ever there was such a thing. And they may be students who were highly gifted. They may be students who didn't speak English. They were all different kinds of kids, but what they had in common is this one particular skill was something that they weren't doing well. Once they mastered that skill, they went on to something else. So what I love about Bright Spots is they defy expectations. There shouldn't be expectations in the first place. But this is one of the highest achieving middle schools, for example, in the state of Washington. And students, their high school graduation rate has moved from 34% to 86% in the last 4 years. So these are the sorts of things that Circle's really interested in. We want to connect leaders from across the country who are in rural spaces. And those of you who are in rural spaces know that while we love being in rural contexts, that there are some challenges that don't exist elsewhere. When you look at the org chart for a large urban district and you look at your org chart, it might be the superintendent or superintendent principal with the bookkeeper who are the central office. And so we have to figure out how we can support them moving on. Let's go to the next slide, please. This network, this rural school leadership network improvement community, is really organic. It began from some early meetings that we started having just before the pandemic, and it became very clear that it wasn't that we should be teaching about improvement science. Instead, we began to be the platform through which people could reach out to each other and learn from each other from peers. And so the university people are not the experts. The people in the field are the experts. And one of the great unintended outcomes that's happened through Circle is leadership preparation is changing, particularly for, one size fits all leadership preparation never worked. And there certainly are some nuances that need to be lifted up in preparing people for rural sites. So this networked improvement community is something where we examine student-centered processes that provide really meaningful evidence of equitable learning environments, and we share with each other. And people have learned to trust. There's almost a cohortness. They've learned to trust very early on so they can talk with each other across this 40+ state and 4 or 5 other countries network about what's working and about what's not working, and they can share that with each other. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is just a quick glimpse These yellow dots are places where we have nodes of our network. You'll notice that there are none in California, and we'd love to have you join us as well. But place matters. And one rural district down the road, 20 miles from another rural district is a dramatically different place than even a district in Kentucky compared to Montana. So we'd like to have people from around the country so that they can really rely on each other and they can learn from folks from different spaces as well. Let's go to the next slide, please. So bright spots, I did a lot of reading about bright spots before I began a bright spot study. And on a sabbatical, I went to Scotland and I went to Wales and I went to Othello, Washington, and to a number of places where I met with people who, by word of mouth, without criteria, were identified as bright spot leaders. Sadly, a lot of them were just great leaders, and people hadn't seen great leaders before. But the ones who I found who really are bright spots are quite remarkable. They're certainly innovative, and they are focused. It's in their DNA that every student, not all students, but every student will be successful. I have a story about the Welsh. In Wales, when I asked people, no matter where it was in the country of Wales, which surprisingly, even though it's a small country and there's a lot of cultural diversity in that country. When I asked them what they do to meet the needs of migrant students, refugee students, they were taken aback that I would even ask that question. They said, what's the problem? If they're here for a day, they're ours. And there's a Welsh word, Carnarvon, that means belonging. And sealed into the Welsh mindset is this construct of Carnarvon. So imagine what a difference our country would be, or any country would be, if we had Carnarvon at our grounding. So these bright spot leaders, we can go to the next slide, please. Bright spot leaders absolutely disrupt inequity, and they are very culturally humble. They think that what they do is what everybody else does, that it's just normal. They're networkers, they're sort of natural networkers, and they have eliminated hierarchies. So they see the teachers as leaders, sitting in on their teachers' meetings. Thanks, Jabari. Sitting in on teachers' meetings was so interesting to listen to teachers leading the meeting and not waiting to be called on, for example, talking about things that don't work. And I've been in plenty of schools myself for years where people wouldn't dare say what wasn't working because they were afraid they'd be judged about that. Looking at bringing the community into the school as well. So when I was in Wales last time, there was a significant energy crisis. And in remote rural Wales, homes are built of stone, interestingly enough, not out of wood. And they have concrete floors, so they're very cold. And families weren't able to heat their homes very well. And so at one meeting in particular that the teachers called, they wanted to brainstorm to see what they could do. And so the head teacher, who is the principal in Welsh schools, asked for their recommendations. And the first person that spoke up was one of the cooks who attended the faculty meeting with no problem. And the cook said, well, they need to have warm tummies. And so what if we get here, I for one am willing to be here at 5 o'clock, and we'll start baking, and we'll invite them to bring their families. And as they come in the door, they will smell warm bread baking and they'll feel welcomed. And then a couple teachers said, well, we could arrange for some other activities once people are done eating. And having been a union president at one time, I couldn't imagine this conversation happening in the places that I've served as a teacher. It's absolutely about truly engaging rural communities so that when families have issues, they can come to the school and talk about it. When the school is having issues, they can come into families and talk about it. And as importantly, they can celebrate together. So this is absolutely an issue about significantly deep systems change. This isn't tinkering at all. Let's go to the next slide, please. My email, I have two emails here. One is my university email and one is my personal email. And there's a website for Circle. And if anyone has any questions or if you're interested in more information, I have lots more to be able to share with you about the SCAP process and things that are working really well, as well as some things that we're struggling with. So I'd love to hear from you and hear what you're doing and learn more about rural California. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Hesbol. We would like to transition over into the discussion question. And I'm fascinated by the way your organization and your work with it and with rural leaders approaches it from the standpoint of not having answers for these rural leaders, but having them address the issues that they're struggling with from their own perspectives, and therefore changing the notion of it, rather than being research to practice, kind of practice to research. So within that context, what are some of the most pressing problems that your rural leaders tell you about that they have identified in their work in trying to achieve, more equitable outcomes for their students?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I think one of them that wasn't apparent initially, and that it's a question that's popping up more frequently, which I'd love to have happen because we deal in inquiry a lot, is the fact that as migrant and refugee students arrive more often now in rural spaces, that the community feels very ill-equipped to be able to meet their needs, and that the teachers don't look like them, that they're racially and culturally and linguistically very different. So in Faribault, Minnesota, they have a partnership with Carleton College, and in the last 10 years, they've had it's not a good scientific description to say dramatic, but they've had a significant increase in Somali population in Faribault, Minnesota. And so not only were there issues about language, but there were certainly cultural issues with which people were unfamiliar. And there are several native indigenous tribal groups in that community as well. They'd had the Faribault High School had all kinds of negative indicators for almost all their students, for their quote mainstream unquote students as well. And so a group of people at Carleton came together and brought families together, and they began to facilitate the conversation, not lead the conversation, but facilitate the conversation, to ask what they felt welcomed about and what they would like to see change. And fast forward today, there are groups of Somali parents who are now English speakers, even newly English speaking, who lead trainings for other Somali families so that they can learn how to call the school when their student is sick, or they can go to a parent conference with them and advocate on behalf of that child in that family. They've also done that, and those Somali families are now engaging the native Spanish speakers as well. So it's changing the culture dramatically at Faribault High School, and I would suggest all the way through the school district as well.
Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about in terms of the relationship that you have with these rural leaders, the identification of bright spot leaders, which is so essential. It's really not just a change in terminology, but it's honoring the work that these leaders do. You've also given us a sense of rural issues that go beyond California, and we're going to eventually try to see where the commonalities are between rural issues in other areas that you've been addressing, as well as what's going on in California. But fortunately, we have a practitioner, Rindy DeVoll, who's going to give us a little bit of insight from her perspective as a member of the executive team for our California MTSS, representing California's rural educators. As the director of the California Rural Educator Network through the Butte County Office of Education, California MTSS Department, Rindy leads efforts to amplify the voices of rural educators, families, and students. Rindy began her educational career as a bilingual teacher and continues to advocate for students and families that are underserved. She believes that California MTSS implementation is the best path to effective and inclusive practices to ensure equity and access for all. So our discussion question for Rindy is, our framing question for today is, looking at what are the key beliefs and practices that educational leaders must embody, but we want to have Rindy talk a little bit about what are the most pressing equity challenges reported by rural school leaders to support marginalized students, and how do you differentiate supports based on the differences across rural contexts, given the differences in challenges, demographics, and resources?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to speak on behalf of rural educators in California. I'm happy to be here, and I'm really excited about hearing about what Professor Hesbol talked about with the circle, the structure of a network improvement community, as we're talking about doing that in California on a more scaled up structure. So to give you a little bit of background, I work for Butte County Office of Education, and so I wear two hats. Not necessarily a rural thing, but through the California Multi-Tiered System of Support Initiative, we launched the California Rural Ed Network. So MTSS is my primary role, and through that, then also through the Butte County Office of Education, we manage the California Rural Ed Network. So thinking about the challenges in our rural areas, I felt compelled when I got invited to speak here to reach out to our network members to see currently sort of what are some of the challenges in equitable practices for them, because I wanted my responses to make sure that they were relevant, timely, and targeted to those educators and what they're experiencing. What I thought was a little bit surprising is I know Professor Hesbol talked more about racially and culturally diverse students. I was a little bit surprised to see the pressing challenges in our rural districts right now are serving students that receive special education services. So there's a movement in California, a lot of people know, to supporting students with extensive support needs. And so it doesn't necessarily address our racial and cultural students, but certainly there's a crossover because some of those students are identified with multiple identities. And so the challenges that we are hearing about are really capacity issues, right? The resources, staffing shortages, we're hearing about that, but not just general ed staff, but more those specialized staffing positions like psychologists and counselors and behavioral and mental health providers on our campuses. And so that's what we're hearing as far as that came up the most, I will say. In addition to that, I will say we mentioned English learners or emergent bilingual students, as well as long-term English learners in California. And in our rural areas, they're finding some challenges in meeting their needs. We talk about our strengths in having smaller class sizes and smaller schools and tight-knit communities. That came up a lot, to have these close-knit communities where families know each other. So I think that's a practice that can be enhanced and expanded on with supporting the leaders with that and how they can address some more of those issues like bilingual education and supporting our students that are multilingual. So that comes to mind. That was the first that we are talking about. I want to address specifically the parts of this question. Differentiating supports based on the differences across rural contexts. So differences in all of that. I really do, and this is not a commercial, but it's research-based that a multi-tiered system of support allows a school and district to be able to dig deep into their data and their practices with the tools and resources that are built in with a coaching model or an independent sort of implementation of a multi-tiered system of support. I really believe that unearths some factors around your school system that would help you to differentiate your supports, really target through a tiered support model, target the needs of students at every level, whatever they need, including those students that have those extensive support needs. As
Thank
far
you.
as, oh, yeah.
So no, go ahead,
I was
please.
just going to say, I'm reading that. As far as demographics is concerned, one of it truly is a real life challenge in the wintertime in California with our diverse landscape. So we talk about diverse populations of people, and our landscape, as you know, in California, from Modoc County down to Inyo County and Imperial, we have diverse landforms, and those natural barriers become real challenges for our rural schools in the wintertime. So we've heard that roads are washed out, and so they limit access. So those are some of those typical things. But even those, when that puts that pressure on a school system, it impedes the opportunities for them to, really continue to move forward and progress. So although we are very nimble and flexible and innovative on ways to make that happen, it is one of those, I'm thinking of all the demographics of challenges.
Thank you so much. And I want to bring Dr. Hesbol back into the discussion, and I want to have you guys together think about one of the things that Dr. Hesbol said is like you could be 20 miles down the road from another rural school district, and the issues that they're facing are dramatically different. And we definitely want to be aware of and sensitive to that wide range of differences as you begin to, Rindy, illuminate in terms of demographics, other kinds of considerations that are apparent in each of the settings. But can we begin with both of you all thinking through and helping us to see, what do you see being the most essential challenges of rural education leaders that are similar despite the rural differences that exist? And I'm going to ask you, Kristina, to jump in on that one first, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. I think, truth be told, my husband was a rural superintendent, so I have firsthand information experience about this, and I was a deputy sup. I think that in so many cases, because the excuse me, the leadership team is such a small group of people that it's very hard. Excuse me. Excuse me. It's really hard to build systems. And depending on your Board of Education, in order to really have a coherent school district with shared vision, you have to have you have to be able to hear people's agendas that they bring to the table, and you have to also be able to move those or adjust those using evidence. I don't like the word data as much as I like the word evidence. Using evidence to show that whatever the concern is either is not actually a concern, or if it is a concern, then how do we build a system that will be able to support those students and perhaps faculty and families within the district? And I think that's very, very difficult to do in a small district.
Thank you. Rindy, do you see similarities across rural districts, even though we understand there are dramatic differences also?
Absolutely. Thank you. And we say that, yeah, sometimes a rural school or a rural community is as unique as a fingerprint, right? And the factors in their own and we go from, the coast over in Mendocino County and Sonoma counties to the desert lands, right? A little bit in Mono and all of that, and just not just the geographical features, but the industries as well that really shape a rural community. And yes, that has effect. I agree so much, Dr. Hesbol, with the superintendent principal hat and the small leadership teams when you can, only do so much. I would also say, besides the word rural in my day, I use the word system probably almost as much. And it is that system, right? And thinking about what are those parts in your system that can be looked at, sort of exposed and looked at, so that you can make those decisions to improve. And what we see too is the neighboring communities, sometimes in certain areas, we're seeing where there is a true collaboration going on. I know connections from Humboldt County to San Benito County where they're sharing. Most recently, in the recent fires that we've had in California, in LA, and of course I'm from Butte County, so we had the Camp Fire in 2018. I'm hearing about conversations happening with our folks that were school districts that were affected by the Camp Fire, talking to people in LA, in the LA area, maybe Altadena, I'm not sure of the exact areas, but really just connecting that way. And whether it's urban, rural or not, humans are connecting with other humans because of shared experiences. And I believe relationships, right? We know that relationships are such a stronghold for humans, whether you're rural, urban, or suburban. And so I think that human connection across our school districts and leaders sharing their shared experiences, I think are key to helping us get to a place where we need to be.
Thank you, Rindy. This is a question for Dr. Hesbol. You talked about how the bright spots that are out there that your circle organization focuses on. Can you give us a little bit of insight from one of the questions from our participants about what some of the dark spots are and how do leaders also adjust to, in the context of work that you're doing with leaders, adjust to and deal with these dark spot challenges?
That's such a great question. Thank you so much for raising that. Well, a neighboring district to where I'm sitting right now eliminated all classroom libraries this year. All classroom libraries are gone. And that's a dark spot. And so how do you, and there's a very strong board. Boards are different in Colorado. Colorado is a local control state, first of all. Mm-hmm. And some boards are 5 members, some are 7 members, some are appointed, some are elected. So it's all over the board. And so if there's a majority of the board that decide that there's evil in classroom libraries, then the dark spot is that the leader has to help the board develop policy to eliminate them. And some of those, I mean, all of us who have been in district leadership have been through that meetings similar to that, where we really differ with what the position is, but we have to figure out how, if not us, then who? How do we get through this and how do we navigate it? So, I know some dark spot leaders who use phrases a lot, like, I understand your position. And I'm sorry you feel that way. And thank you for sharing. Which isn't to say that you're in agreement, but we have to keep the conversation going. And so that it's not just turning over and quitting. I think rural communities have gotten very bad press in the past number of years. And I think they're being most significantly impacted by some of the decisions that are being made across the country. And so I think that we're on the brink of being able to have rural people take a stand in a way that maybe they haven't ever been listened to before. Having food deserts and health deserts and preschool, before and after school care deserts. It's not acceptable. It wasn't acceptable in urban spaces. it's not acceptable in rural spaces. And if this is the United States, then we have to figure out ways that those people who put up with dark spots a lot can come into the light and be able to network with other people, to feel like they have that they can lean into each other.
Yes, thank you so much, Kristina. And rather than going too deep into that well of dark spots, but I wanted us as a webinar to also be aware for leaders that it's not all bright spots that we're having to deal with and wrestling with those challenges. I would like to have Rindy sort of continue that discussion from the standpoint that obviously one of the key issues that might be considered a dark spot is making sure that equity is addressed for all of the people, the challenges of equity. So what specific capacities have you found most critical for rural school leaders to develop when addressing equity challenges in their context? And I'd like to start with you, Rindy.
Sure. Yeah, I think it is that that came up in the survey. Also, some people were really concerned with even the word equity. So I took a risk, right, and put it out there. We're talking about equitable practices, whatever that means to you. I'd like you to, respond to that. And some people were saying they have real mixed communities, and that use of word and other terminology that has been eliminated, much like books and libraries, right? And not able to say certain things. So they work around it by changing terminology. They work around it by just calling it something different. And that's one way that they've combated sort of those ideas, where they know they have the attitudes and beliefs that are in place that need to be for their students and families in their area, despite the pushback of certain community members that don't feel comfortable with all of that. I think also some rural communities we're seeing across California are just resilient. They've got resiliency in a lot of different areas, and so they're working toward that. And I think the student voice is helping a lot. We're hearing an uptick in some student voices that are being amplified, that are starting to help reshape the school's culture, right? That school campus culture identity, into making it more of representative of our student populations, which we know, just like you said, Dr. Hesbol, sometimes our teachers and students don't share the same, right, appearance, right? We're predominantly in rural areas, maybe white.
So let me pick up on that resilience theme, Rindy, and pose this question to both of you all as we sort of move to a close of our webinar for today. The question is, then what are the most impactful ways in which educational leaders can leverage the unique cultural and ecological context of rural school districts to disrupt the kinds of inequities that are out there from your own experiences in your separate areas? And Kristina, can we start with you, Dr. Hesbol?
Sure, I'm Kristina. I'm aware of a remote rural district who had a really creative high school English teacher. And that high school English teacher taught all 4 years of high school and taught the junior high. And he decided that their students in the community, even those who had been there for generations, didn't know much about their community. They were embarrassed about their community in some ways. So he got a grant. He wrote a grant and was awarded the grant, not accidentally, I'm sure. Students could apply for the grant and teachers could apply for the grant. And I think it was a $150 stipend that they were eligible for if they were awarded the grant. And what they had to do was to go find an elder in the community and do an oral history interview about something that was meaningful to that person who'd grown up in that community. And the paradigmatic shifts, here we go again with paradigms, the paradigmatic shifts were remarkable. And suddenly children who, even those who'd grown up there, who didn't know much about it other than their community, they felt wasn't, it's not as shiny as the city or all the things that people have stuck in the back of their heads, all of a sudden they had never seen such beautiful fields. They had never seen such fabulous forests. They had never seen coasts. All the sorts of things that they had just taken for granted. And it also brought the elders into the schools in a really productive way.
Rindy, what about you in terms of the same question?
Right. We're hearing about our indigenous folks in certain areas of California where they're lending tribal support. So coming onto campuses and supporting schools in general. And I think bridging that gap between those cultures that are, we don't understand necessarily because you live far on a reservation and, out of the community. So a lot of our tribes and we still have work to do, but we're bridging those gaps and making those connections with that. I think also I want to say, place-based education. You had mentioned that before, and I think there's those places where they're really, whether they call it place-based education or not, they really are understanding the locality, that historical, cultural context of their own area is something that is enough to be explained, shared, all of that. We also talk about through California MTSS, one of our themes for our institute in the summer was know my name, face, and story. So we're talking about relationship building. I took that theme and continued it on through our California Rural Ed Network, and really encouraging folks to just tell a story, because somebody may have, most likely will have a connection to you in some way, some sort of shared experience. Really believing that the impact comes when we build those strong relationships. And so through story sharing, that can happen. Those are a few examples. I have others, but.
All right. Well, those are great examples. And I'd like to ask one more question of each of our guests. And I'll direct the first question to you, Dr. Hesbol. You're not in California, so we having you give us a little bit of reflection from your perspective of something that we're attempting to do in 21 CSLA, which is create a research model that emphasizes the interconnectedness between professional context, leadership capacities, and equity outcomes. So in your own work, how do you see these three elements interacting specifically in rural educational settings? That's, the interconnection between the professional context on the one hand, the leadership capacities on the other hand, and the equity outcomes.
Thank you for repeating those. They're inseparable. And until we put those on the table, it's unpacking mental models. And it's really hard to do that, even our own mental models, until we put them on the table and then we call them into question. And so learning how to do that in ways that are not offensive, but that are really helping us to learn more about the centrality of that work. The praxis of all of that is it's so different from what is being done in many educational leadership programs. And if you haven't been leading in schools since the pandemic, you're in a whole different world, a completely different world. And I would say that the rural schools were actually much more nimble during that time, but the profession, looking at leaders, who are different from administrators. Leaders lead, administrators manage, and we're interested in how do we support that intersection of leaders who are who themselves are interested and whose system is interested in building capacity and sustainability for every learner.
Wow, thanks a lot. So Rindy, one final question for you. I hope it's not unfair, but I think that as you're engaging with actual leaders on the ground and dealing with these sort of understanding their roles in practice and influence in practice, we can't forget the overarching impact and influence of policy. So a question to you, and if you want to jump in on it also, Kristina, we have time. What policy changes at the state level would be most effective in supporting equity leadership, equity-centered leadership in diverse rural contexts? And for you, Rindy, it would be diverse rural contexts in California, and Kristina, you could talk about diverse rural context in whatever state. If you want to do Colorado, that would be great too. So Rindy, let's start.
I love that. Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, we often say in rural, as it relates to policies, one size doesn't fit all. So, we have our local control accountability plan, and some of our policies are just not enough. From what I'm hearing, they're not universally designed for some of our rural leaders, right? Anytime you have so many pages, the expectation or the perceived expectation of completing some of these documents and then going through that. When you do wear those multiple hats, when you are the superintendent principal, I know somebody in county near Sacramento, I can't think of it right now, who is not only the superintendent principal teacher and also the custodian, very small school, 12 students. So he wears all of the hats, and to expect him to complete the same documentation and, administer all of those practices himself is just, it's not fair, and it is not equitable. And so we're trying to amplify those voices. We have a partnering organization in California, the Small School Districts Association. And so they also kind of take on a lot more of those policy changes. But we try to amplify the voice through the California Rural Ag Network of those things that we need to customize a little bit, give a little bit of pressure release on some of our small rural remote systems to be able to operate in a way that makes sense. The other thing is getting us at the table. We have a lot of initiatives in California, most recently through the system of support, and the rural voice comes up, but it's not as formal as I would like it. So we're trying to get an elevated sort of, place at the table to make sure that our voice is heard. Because I hear every day from rural educators, we were at this professional learning place, we were somewhere, and we just didn't feel like we belonged. They weren't talking to us. And so that's clearly equitable, right? That sense of belonging. So
Yes.
through policies, we're working on that.
So I want to change my question based on what you just said, Rindy, to Kristina to address exactly what you're saying. As we look forward to future educational leadership preparation specifically, and you're a professor, Dr. Hesbol, how might programs better prepare leaders for specific equity challenges of rural communities? And of course, California would be the rural community that we're most directly associated with. But are there things that need to happen in the transformation of leader preparation that will facilitate those leaders being able to be better leaders in rural areas?
Great question. Thank you. 3 years ago, there was a pre-session at UCEA. There was the first ever rural pre-session. And we rented out and we chartered a big bus, and we took 80 people from Seattle up to a port. And at the port, we got on a ferry and we took these 80 people to an island and visited an island school. 60 of those 80 people had never been in a rural school, period. And they were dumbfounded. They didn't know where the district office was, and they didn't know where, all these other things that they were accustomed to. So I think to prepare people, there's always a naivete, and I only work with doc students. I don't work with undergrads, so I'm not as equipped as I should be to be discussing the preparation of teachers. But as we prepare superintendents, for example, there's a naivete that people know what they're going to be doing 5 years from now. And if there's anything we learned through the pandemic, we don't know what we're going to be doing 2 years from now. So I'd love to see some kind of a process whereby people have opportunities to do internships or residencies in a place other than where they grew up or other than what they think is ideal, because they'll find not only that one size fits few, as you suggest, Rindy, but they'll suggest that the preparation needs to be different. And Circle is finding that preparation among our university partners, preparation is changing as a result of what they're learning out in the field. We have a partner in the Hebrides Islands in Scotland, And she says that if there's one student on an island, that in Scotland, they will develop a school. They'll find a teacher and they'll develop a school. And I think about how when I was in Illinois, we were constantly looking to see how we could consolidate districts to have fewer and fewer because it was going to be so expensive. In Colorado, there is as a result of SCAP, the state board did approve a policy whereby using the student-centered accountability project model, they can use that as an alternative data point to their accountability. So with very small n's and personally identifiable information and data that comes in after students are gone, the state recognized that being able to have evidence that comes in based on what the surveys were telling the district are things that people think are important, that would in fact be really valuable. And so the state has made that change. There's also, as you were suggesting a little bit earlier too, Rindy, that we have a lot of youth participatory action research going on, and where students are going into legislative sessions and not just listening, but they're being asked to testify. So I think there's a shift afoot. We don't have the amazing network that you have in California, and albeit a very large state, and there's never enough support, but the fact that you even have this organization, and then you have through MTSS to be able to transition to other organizations focused on rural, because policies are not written for small rural communities. They're written for large, typically urban or metropolitan organizations.
Thank you.
Thank you again. We have a very active participant group here, and they're sharing information like a 2-year NSF project called STEM Strong at the University of South Dakota. Invited California as one of 4 rural states to engage in these kind of issues with each other. So we're glad that you provided us with your contact information, because I think some of our participants are definitely going to want to follow up. Excuse me for 1 second.
Oh, no, you're good.
So we want to thank our participants for these wonderful questions, and we also want to thank you too for sharing your time with us to learn more about these key equity challenges and promising practices emerging in rural contexts. Before we end, we'd like to encourage everyone to share their reflections and feedback using the link here, and it would also be shared in the chat. Please also subscribe to the 21 CSLA newsletter to be notified when the next webinar will be coming out, and also it will be one centered on artificial intelligence. Also, please keep the conversation going. We look forward to staying in touch across all of our communication channels, including our website and social media. And finally, we feel like a free visit to our website will be really instrumental in you learning more about 21 CSLA. So read our latest briefs, subscribe to the 21 CSLA monthly newsletter, and in particular, we encourage you to review the 21 CSLA research brief on equity-driven leadership in rural education. With over 9.5 million students, more than 1 in 5 attending rural schools, these communities face unique challenges, including leadership shortages, limited resources, and persistent deficit narratives. This brief highlights these inequities while offering insights into how equity-driven leadership can create meaningful change. We encourage you to take a look and consider how its findings connect to today's discussion. And with that, we'd just like to say thank you all for participating, particularly our 2 leaders, our researcher and our practitioner, and we welcome you all back to the next webinar that we'll be having under 21 CSLA. Thank you.